Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending where you are. And thank you for joining us for today's session, all about the latest from the newest edition of CIS Controls version 8.1. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our presenters to introduce themselves. Jim, say hello, and what should folks know about you?
Well, thank you, Zoe. Hi, everybody. Jim Goldman, CEO and co-founder of Travis Security. Very nice. My background is really in cybersecurity for about 35 years. Companies such as Salesforce. I was also a task force officer with the FBI Cybercrime Task Force. And really my passion was to bring the discipline in security governance, risk management, and compliance that we built at Salesforce down into a affordable and I would use the word understandable manner for sub-enterprise, mid-market, state and local government, et cetera. So that's why I'm here today. Matt?
I'm Matt Warner. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Blumira. My background is in cybersecurity as well as software engineering and data engineering, all the fun stuff that come with it. Um, and I started Blumira to really kind of drive some better way into, we'll say, making SIM make any sense to anyone. But here today, we're not here to necessarily talk about that. We're here to talk about CIS and challenges around public utilities, state and local government, all the fun stuff around that. So today, here's the general agenda of what we're looking at. As Zoe said, please throw any questions in if you have any questions for us. Otherwise, I'm sure we will continue to dig through it as we talk about state and local gov, strategic solutions, and then how you can partner with Blumira and Trava as we move forward. So if you're watching this live, you're watching the record, doesn't particularly matter. We're going to be talking a lot today around kind of what we see in state and local government, kind of the industries attached to state and local government. Think about public utilities, think about how those kind of interact with their state and local governments in general, and how we kind of see the market as a whole at this point, and how we can kind of make life a little easier looking forward, especially in the case of CIS and other compliances that you all are dealing with, generally speaking. And we'll touch a little bit as well, I'm sure, on geopolitics, because it has a lot to do with especially the state and local gov and their impact from a security perspective. So, as we look across the environment, we'll say, of state and local gov and their related areas like utilities and to an extent education as well. One of the main issues that we see, and just broadly what the industry sees, is that there is only more attacks against these types of organizations, and more importantly, there are targeted attacks against these types of organizations. And in general, when you have an increase in attack volume because there is information that is valuable, and we'll talk a little more about why that's valuable for ransomware as well as just broadly, and you add in the fact that there's a limited budget to really bring to bear associated with these situations, it creates an instance where organizations really have a situation where it's hard to get to where they need to get to, or where they feel like they need to get to, or when they look at CIS or similar compliances, they go, this is insane. How am I going to get to this part? Especially when you look at situations like CGIS that'll say like 7 years of retention. Most organizations are not, I don't care how big you are equipped to say, right, we'll store 7 years of data and hope that we can do something about that 6 years from now. It is a hard thing to do, especially when there's a limited budget. And of course, when you have compliance continuing to change or additional impact, especially if you work with any sort of gov level, Fed levels, with CMMC coming down and CIS with there and CGIS also there, it only gets more complex for organizations, and the budget doesn't necessarily change. The way that we at Blumira often talk about this when we're talking with our customers is that, and I just went through this here where I live, most people don't want to vote for a bond or millage that's going to make them have to pay more for something that they don't really see the output of, but they will definitely care when all their information gets stolen from that state and local gov. So how do you split that difference when people don't want to pay more, but you need to have something moving forward? And of course, the attack surface is always changing, right? Especially in the case of state and local gov and utilities, what your attack surface was 5, 10 years ago is entirely different from a threat perspective now. So thinking about kind of where you are now, where you're going, how that's changing, it all kind of gets more complex. And as we get a little kind of further up into the world, it gets really blurred because of geopolitics and kind of how this all falls together. And Jim, you worked for the FBI, you've seen these kind of things. I'd love to hear kind of from your perspective, what do these risks look like and kind of where are they going?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. What's kind of interesting is when I was with the FBI from 2008 to 2013, we were facing many of these same challenges, but it's almost like, I don't want to use the word afraid, but we were afraid to publicize what we were doing, right?
Sure.
And so to me, it's very significant that Director Wray is not mincing words, is saying in no uncertain terms that countries like China and North Korea and Iran are actively working, day in and day out to undermine the critical infrastructure, the security of the critical infrastructure of the United States. So just that fact is not lost on me. So if this is what they're saying out loud, what you have to understand is it's probably 10 times worse than what they're saying publicly.
Very much so. Yeah, it's interesting in that I don't think most organizations realize that APTs are floating around and there is an inevitability of getting hit by them depending on who you are. We at Blumira have seen a number of like Iranian, what did they call their oil rig
Right.
attacks, and it's not for any reason other than it was a fairly high value target that left Microsoft Outlook exposed, and there's a whole lot of ways to break into that. So it's interesting in that for us on the detection side, the APTs haven't necessarily needed to get better because the targets are out there. Like
Right.
it's not like they need to sit down and be like, what about the 0 day? It's there for them to kind of hit if they need to.
Yeah, and the thing about APTs, I don't know why this popped into my head. We've probably all seen the movie Independence Day, right? Where, all of the ships got deployed all
Mm,
over the world. Well, that's what these APTs are.
yep.
Just because there isn't something like drastically noticeable going on your systems right now doesn't mean that there isn't code just sitting there waiting for a certain point in time,
Yep.
right? When that code will be activated. And if you read carefully what Director Wray is saying, that's really what he's worried about. It's not that you're seeing attacks today, it's that all of this code's being deployed everywhere. And because of some geopolitical event in the future, bam, that's when it's all going to be ignited.
And related to the topic on the right, when you have like PRC out of China, they're not dropping ransomware. Like North Korea is going to drop ransomware to make money. Parts of the GRU out of Russia are going to drop ransomware to make money. PRC is not dropping ransomware to make money. They are taking data. They are staging attacks, generally
They're
speaking.
staging.
Yep.
Absolutely right.
And it's important to keep that in mind, right? Because it matters who and what you're exposing. And I think most people think about ransomware as the most direct threat, generally speaking. And for you, Jim, how do you look at kind of that crossover of defense against ransomware and defense against APTs? Does it differ much for you, or from a compliance perspective at least?
It really doesn't. And that's actually sort of a brilliant segue into why we use a framework like CIS,
Hmm.
because it's sort of like you can't play whack-a-mole and say, well, I have to protect against this, and then I have to do this other thing to protect against that. It's like, no, time out. Look at an entire framework of, industry uh, debated
Hmm.
control families, which is exactly what CIS is,
Yep.
and then measure how mature you are in each of those control families, and then put together a plan to increase your maturity. And, with that lens of risk, we're going to talk about this later on. But you look at the risk as to where are your most unlocked doors, right? Where are the windows that you're leaving open, et cetera. That's what you need to fix first. Yes, you need to take into account that changing threat landscape that we talked about, but you can't be, always reacting and jumping from
Right.
this and oh, we have to, protect against that other thing, because
Yep.
all you're doing is you're wasting time and money at that point. You're spinning your wheels, literally.
Yeah, you're better off spending your time in prevention and securing than response
Correct.
in the grand
Yes.
scheme of it all.
Yes.
Everyone who's gone through response knows like it's one step forward, two steps back during that response effort. It just is because, especially if they're in your network, it is a hard effort at that
And
point.
that's one of the things I love about the NIST cybersecurity framework, which we've talked about on other webinars, is
Mm.
the order of events. The stages are protect, detect,
Yep.
respond, recover, etc. And
Yep.
and so the more investment you put in protecting, the less you have to worry about detect and respond.
For sure. Yes. Yeah. And in the case of, I in general, when you manufacturing is a similar problem as well, where you're talking about 10, 20, 30, 40-year-old networks, depending on the organization. And I think that there are a lot of places that said, for good reason, 20 years ago, we're going to put this up because we need to manage this remotely. And now there is this just continuous impact that comes from that. It just is sadly
So
kind of
vulnerable.
the
Yeah.
resulting impact. Exactly. So next we're going to talk a little bit about, and we're going to tie this all together, don't worry, where Blumira looks and sees from the standpoint of the gov and related industries, kind of what we're seeing on the threat side, what we're seeing on the risk side, what kind of data are we seeing? And I think it does a really good job of showing exposure. It's just kind of the natural impact of gov, of utilities, of education, and how it's kind of to an extent attached to this as well, where there's a need to share information. Like people need to connect into an environment, you need to share information. It is a necessity for these kind of things to happen. And in what we see inside of these types of environments is kind of as Blumira moves into them, and it doesn't matter if you use Blumira or not, but this is the data I have, so it's a perfect example for this, is the kind of need to continue to grow kind of how things are working. So like impossible travel is a great example of, as an organization, if you're a state and local gov, do you have people that need to be able to log in from a different country? Can you put in conditional access so you don't run into this situation anymore? If you are working out of Tennessee, should people only be authenticating from there because that is where you're housed inside of? And really kind of starting to tighten up how your environment looks and how it feels and how people are leveraging data. And that kind of falls into, people saving passwords in plain text files just as much as it does is thinking about how files are being shared out of that environment, just because those are where you start seeing additional exposures, you start seeing kind of how that environment is put together. Additionally, from a risk perspective, it really kind of just goes back to exposure. That people, generally speaking, in these types of networks, are going to be exposing SSH. They're going to be not necessarily exposing Telnet, but allowing Telnet to connect. And what that tells us is that there aren't strong ACLs inside of the network at the border coming into that network. And that isn't because it's anyone's fault. It's because most organizations that have had firewalling for 20 years built the ACLs then to deny specific things. And as we've gone over the last 10, 15 years, there's been this kind of changeover of, all right, we need to move to default denial, and then we will poke holes where we need to poke holes. But moving from allowing and unsure to deny all and build is a huge mental ask for a lot of people in IT. If there are two IT people, you're basically saying rebuild the entire inbound network. That is a huge ask for them. So that results in these kind of exposures that we see inside of the data. Additionally, one of the big things that we see, partially, I find it really interesting. There's a lot of authentication outside the US and gov, local gov here in our data, which is all US data. And that tells me, we may have more exposures than we may be intending to do, or maybe we have more people traveling than we need to do. So it really gets back to what Jim was talking about of what is the compliance? What is the policy for these organizations? Should people be authenticating from Europe when they travel? Should this be a situation where you have conditional access in place so they don't? I also find it really interesting that Gov is one of our top cohorts for RDP being exposed to the internet. And when we say that, again, it may be that the ACLs just allow it, which we also consider a problem from a risk perspective, because what happens if you put a machine up at that IP behind there that now will accept that RDP connection? I will tell you what will happen. It will get authenticated into, because that is what happens. But also, we do see this kind of, and you see in the dual lockout, you see in the excessive number of MFA enrollment skips, people having trouble with 2FA in these types of areas. Generally speaking, utilities, local gov were later to 2FA compared to, we'll say, high tech for obvious reasons. And in those situations, it tends to be a hard to adopt, hard to train, hard to get used to it. People love to skip the requirement of it. I'm sure we've all kind of dealt with these situations. I know my local school where my son goes to school, they're dealing with a situation where G Suite will give you 2 weeks to enroll MFA. And if you don't enroll at that period, you get blocked. But there's just a bunch of teachers that will basically just ride that 2 week window and then ask for a reset every 2 weeks because they just don't want to deal with it. So making sure you get the training in place becomes really, really important around there.
Hey, Matt, real quick on that. I just
Please
want to jump in.
go
You
for it.
said a word that I think really underlies a lot of the current problems. And you used the word border. Like, where's the border
Mm,
of your network?
yep.
And, if we'd asked that question 5 years ago, we would have gotten one answer. Ask it today, you get a very different answer. A lot of it had to do
Yes.
with the pandemic. Everybody started working from home,
Yep.
pre-pandemic. We were in the office, we were behind a corporate firewall. The corporate network was well defined, everything was centralized, et cetera, et cetera. Now everyone's on their laptop, not just from home, but from a coffee shop, or they're on vacation, or who knows where. Wow. How do you define that border and how do you protect it?
It is wild how much COVID changed everything, especially for the state and local gov and utilities who all of a sudden are like, well, you can't come in here. So how are we going to do this? It
But the utilities still have to run,
They
even
sure
though you
do.
can't come to work.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, getting VPNs up, you know, the true impact of COVID from a security perspective, I think is incredibly interesting because it changed everyone's networks at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Like Blumira, we started about 2 years before the pandemic started. And at that point, everyone was shipping data on-prem. That's how they were handling it. They were just pulling data on-prem. Within 2 months of COVID starting, there was this frantic changeover of we need to figure out how we're going to, I mean, to the benefit of all of us, it killed on-prem Outlook pretty much exclusively. So that is
Yes.
something. So that's great. Like we still see it sometimes and it's terrifying. But it is, it pushed so many areas forward. But you're right, it took that concept of that hard border and basically broke it down to like it's more of a Swiss
It's more like
cheese.
Swiss cheese.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There you go. We're both hungry, it seems. So that we'll move into an area that I think is really interesting, where resolution rate by industry. So this is based on about 250 local gov and utility in the U.S. So to give an idea for the sample size here for everyone, uh, local gov, and utilities are tied with banking for us at a really our highest resolution rate, up around 80%. We consider that solid. We'd love it to be 100% for everyone. But really 80% showing attainment, showing they care, getting into that environment, working what's happening. That is how you improve your maturity over time. So we love to see this high resolution rate moving through these types of organizations because that tells us they're growing in maturity. You're getting better, you're improving those areas, and in general, you are moving forward, which is always a good thing. And Jim, I wanted to ask you from the standpoint of like compliance, response, how do you look at resolution rate and kind of start to like pull that into a framework where you want to push people to say like you want to aim for this?
Yep. And you use the word maturity, which I think is key here. So we look at everything through a lens of risk, right? Overall
Yep.
cyber risk. And risk can be measured and maturity can be measured. And that's why I'm so excited to talk about the CIS controls today, because that is an industry standard methodology, almost like an industry standard report card that regardless of what industry you're in, you can come up with a number as to how mature are you, which of those 18 control families are you least mature in, should you invest time in, et cetera, et cetera. And so, when state and local government or utilities go looking for budget, and they need justification, understandably so, people want to say, well, where are you today? Like, how risky are you today? How mature are you today? What's industry best practice? Where should you be? You identify that gap and you say, well, here's what we need to do in the next 12 months or 18 months or, biennial budget cycle or whatever it is. And that should take us from this score of
Yep.
maturity in these families to this score. that's the kind of thing that non-technical people can understand.
Yep.
If you go to a non-technical person that controls the budget and say, I gotta buy this, hard to understand technology, or I gotta buy
Right.
this hard to
Yep.
understand technology, you're going to get a blank stare because they don't get it. If you
Yep.
say, I need to take my risk from here down to here, this is what it's going to cost. This is what's going to happen if we don't do it. Okay, I get that.
Yep. No, that totally makes a ton of sense. Yes, I never recommend going to your executive financial person saying I would like zero trust. Definitely aim for what it is kind of tying down for sure. And I think this might be, yeah, my last data side that I want to touch on is what we see the most from Gov and utilities. Probably unsurprising to everyone, Microsoft 365 and Windows machines tend to be the top. I do want to call out for Google Workspace because of the education component of Google Workspace. There's almost always some amount of Google Workspace inside of local gov, and usually inside of their K-12 environments. So if you are a local gov that is monitoring your M365 environment and you have a K-12 schools that are attached to your networks, it's worth looking and seeing kind of how they are addressing protection of their Google Workspace environments as well. The other big one that we see is VMware, and I expect this to change with the Broadcom acquisition of VMware some. But this is one of those areas where budget and local gov really gets beat up because Broadcom controls now the virtualization market, and VMware are going to push those prices up. And kind of as we've been talking about, gov and utilities do not have a lot of people to then say like, all right, well, we're going to just forklift this up into Azure and we're going to make it work in a different place. So my concern is that we are now going to see outdated VMware environments going across these environments, trying to be kind of pushed into a small hole. And, that just creates new rich targets in these environments when that happens. So, for those of you who are on VMware, looking at moving from VMware, there are some solid options. But in general, monitoring on VMware becomes really important at that point, depending on where you're landing. For this one surprised me. The most used firewall inside of Gov and Utilities for us is WatchGuard. WatchGuard is definitely growing in its use more broadly, especially as Fortinet has fallen off being kind of the more cheaper, glorious option compared to Palo Alto. And for WatchGuard, it has a pretty solid set of tools and functions around it, but it's important to validate kind of thinking back to what we looked at in the data. What's your ACL look like? What's your default look like? How is that passing traffic in and out of your environment? And your SSL VPN is always going to be important as well. And the last one that I'll touch on, the Sentinel-1 tends to be the largest or most used inside of Gov as well. We're big fans of Sentinel-1. It's a good piece of technology. What we always recommend is checking to see how it's set up. It is very good at detecting known threats. It is not necessarily great at detecting unknown threats. So you want to kind of evaluate your EDR coverage to say, what is the behavior detection? What is the known bad stuff detection? And the last one that we'll touch on here, that we'll get into the compliance side, is kind of where we've seen proven risk across these kind of local gov and kind of the exposed environments around them. And it tends to be in kind of these four main areas. VDI desktops, especially, Jim, to your point, with the changeover of COVID, a lot of places just said, well, we have VMware, we'll put VMware Horizon in, and then we're going to kind of move forward with VDI desktops. The issue with that, as kind of the whole topic that we started this at, there was a large campaign against VMware Horizon when Log4j dropped, where the people were dropping ransomware, and then APT started leveraging those attacks against the environments. CISA was handling the response out to local govs in that situation. And while they were able to support a lot of the local govs, it resulted in a situation where kind of we had to think more about, what does the border look like? Should we be exposing these things? Should it be behind a VPN? Should there be 2FA in place? How is this being kind of structured across it? The other ones that I like to touch on are just and exactly what Jim, you were saying, there's just a lot of exposures, and just because you still have to do the work, your water treatment plant still has to work. And your water treatment plant probably hasn't had new technology put into it in the last 10 to 20 years, especially from an IT perspective. So it's really about how do you take these kind of risks and ensure that you're kind of driving the best success for what you have in your environment. And Jim, I'd be interested to hear for you if you think back in local gov, where have you seen, and it could be in compliance or it could be actual or actual attacks, where have you seen kind of the biggest impact to maturity in these organizations that these kind of events have occurred because they have not been able to kind of grow their maturity up?
You know, it's not a technical answer,
That's
Matt. Actually, it's more of an organizational answer,
sure.
and there is some good news to it, and that is governance.
Mm,
And it's no coincidence that both the NIST CSF and now the CISV 8.1 following along have added governance as a required
mm,
element of a mature security program. So let me explain real briefly about why that is. All right. In smaller organizations, like many, local governments and local public utilities, the IT worry, IT and security, that's kind of looked upon as the nerds over there by elected officials and so forth. And it's
mm.
almost like they don't want to take responsibility for it, other than they want to make sure their emails work. And if I offend anybody, with my generalizations, I apologize. However, risk is not owned by the security department or the IT department. Risk is owned by senior most management in every single organization, whether it's a government organization or an industrial organization, public company, private company, doesn't matter. That senior most management understands and has been responsible, boards of directors, et cetera, has been responsible for high level risk for a long time, and they know how to do that, right? But it's things like business risk, financial risk, international financial markets, on and on and on.
Yep.
Cyber has never, I shouldn't say has never, has only recently been elevated up to that board level, in some cases by regulation and legislation saying, oh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, SEC, et cetera, in the United States said, oh, yes, board members, you are now responsible for monitoring, managing, properly investing funds, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
That is just as an important risk. You're on the hook for managing cyber risk as much as any other risk.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think ensuring that responsibility grows beyond IT and people understand that responsibility is, number one in that, of course. And having
It's
that,
now an organizational
yeah,
responsibility and an organizational risk. It's not an IT risk.
no, yes, exactly. IT just has to impact that risk.
Implement it, right.
Yes, yes. All right. So we're going to move into a little bit more focus on compliance and talking more directly about CIS, how CIS is fitting together. We're going to put a poll out here as well here in a second around, there it is, around, has my company has used CIS control framework in the past as a guideline. Have you? Have you not? Are you considering it? We'd love to hear some additional kind of thoughts. If you have any comments on that in the chat around how you are leveraging CIS. And of course, the kind of big topic is CIS 8.1. And I'll hand that over to Jim to kind of start talking about the takeaways.
Thank you, Matt. So as you can probably tell, I'm pretty excited about this stuff. So CIS version 8, has been around for a while. We've been using that for some time as our kind of industry standard for benchmarking our clients. When 8.1 came out, there were really two fairly significant improvements, I guess I'll say modifications. One was the addition of the governance section in order to align with what NIST CSF did a few months previous. And, I was just talking about the importance of that, so I won't reiterate that. But then also they revised their asset classes with new mappings to the particular safeguards in the different control families, which is terrific. Because if you think about it, and we'll look at the control families in a second. If you think about it, if you don't, this is sort of the premise underlying the whole thing. If you don't know what you're trying to protect, if you don't know what you need to protect, how can you properly protect it?
Yep.
Now, that may sound kind of silly, but for those of us that have been in IT for a while, we know how truthful that is, right? It's like, what what's the one thing that's going to bite you in the place where you don't want to be bitten? It's the thing you didn't know about. It's
Right.
the unknown asset. How can you protect an asset you don't know about? And
Yep.
so asset inventory and asset classification is super important. In some ways, it's the fundamental thing that you have to get right. It's the first thing. And yet, for whatever reason, it's often ignored. Like when we go in and we assess companies initially, they've got this tool implemented, they got that tool implemented, and we say, do you have anything to do asset inventory that's like it's always accurate and it's always up to date? It's almost always no.
Yeah, asset management such a strange technology that it's evolved over the last 20 years, but I don't think it's evolved in a way that people are like, this is perfect, this is what I
No, and
want.
I don't think there's any simple answer either,
No,
because
no,
it's like
no.
assets. Well, we know about all our laptops and we got secure configuration and all our laptops is, have the gold image on it. Great. Well, what about, that old server that's still under someone's desk,
Yep.
that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, those are the scariest ones, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
And so this is the new asset class, how they organize. So that's the what. And then how this whole thing works is the controls and the safeguards say, okay, how do you protect them? So what do you protect? And then how do you protect them? That's how that works together. The other thing I really love about CIS in general, this is not new to 8.1, they've had it for a while, is they don't feel like one size fits all. Unlike a lot of other frameworks that are out there, it's like, just do these things. And it's like, wait a minute, like you were saying earlier, Matt, I'm a 2-person IT organization, that kind of thing. Or I only have, 15 laptops or something like that. And you're telling me I have to implement what, Microsoft has to do,
Right.
or something like that. And so that's another thing I really like, is they've got these things called implementation groups. You can actually go to the next slide, because I've got kind of an inventory there. You can see implementation group 1, which is where we start most of our customers. It's 56 safeguards. All right. Pretty reasonable. And some of those are even not applicable. For instance, control family 16, you can see it there, application software security. If you don't develop your own application
Right.
software, that might not be applicable, that kind of thing. So at most, it's 56 safeguards. That's IG1. What we usually do is we usually get our customers up to, a maturity level of 3 or 4 or so on those 56 safeguards. And then we start talking about implementation group 2, kind of pepper them in. I'll say, okay, in this control family, you probably want to go to IG2, that type of thing. Then the other thing that I really enjoyed about this was I inventoried, okay, of the 18 control families that you see on the right, how many of those does Blumira and Trava take care of, at least to some degree? Now, I want to be clear. We're not saying if you buy Trava and you buy Blumira, like that's 100% of all the safeguards. No, what
Boom.
we're saying is, there are safeguards within each of these
Right.
control families that we take care of. So, interestingly enough, the only control family that neither Blumira or Trava do anything directly in is malware defense. And
Exactly.
so,
Yeah.
but there are plenty of good, technologies out there that do that.
You can use Sentinel-1 for
Yes,
that.
exactly.
They do great.
So I wanted to break this down and say, okay, regardless of the size of the organization that you're in, this doesn't have to be that complicated. It really is a strategic approach. It really is quite a simple process. Don't get overwhelmed. Take it one step at a time. And, as I say here, as I alluded to earlier, the first thing you need to know is, what do you have for assets? You have to inventory your assets. What is it that you're trying to protect? And then you need to say, okay, if that's my landscape, if that's what I need to protect, well, what are the risks? Everybody's risks are different. What are your most serious threats and risks? And so that's where you do that risk assessment. Now, the CIS V8 is actually quite good at that, because you can go down through that whole list of safeguards in each control family, and you can say, am I doing that? Yes or no. You can do it binary, yes or no. The way we do it is we use something called the capability maturity model
Hmm.
from Carnegie Mellon, et cetera, was originally done for the Software Engineering Institute, but it goes in maturity levels from 0, which is like, we don't do this at all,
Yep.
up to 5, which is not only do we do it, but it's documented, it's
The full process.
standardized, it's
Yep.
continuously monitored, it's continuously managed. We have optimization thresholds and there's automation, et cetera. 5 is almost like off the charts, right?
Yep.
In some cases impractical. And so where we try to get our customers on the CMM model in these different safeguards is right around that 3.0 mark. If
Hmm.
you're hitting a 3.0 out of 5, that's really good. So, the lower your maturity level, the higher your risk. That's how you kind of quantitatively, again, your budget committees or whoever you're reporting to, they're going to want to see data. They're not going to say, that not necessarily going to listen to you say, "Hey, we really need this." Why? Because I said so. You have to give them the data, and so that's the nice thing about the CIS is like, here's our
Yeah.
report card. We're failing right here.
Yep. That
Then
makes
you
a lot of sense.
prioritize based on your risks because you have budget cycles. We can't afford to do everything. Obviously, you protect your most valuable assets, and then you then have to close the loop by making sure you're monitoring. It's a continuous loop. I've got another slide later on. So you plan, do, check, act.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense, and that's I think the hardest part for a lot of people moving to GRC or compliance or being thrust into it is that it doesn't stop. It is a loop that you must kind of continue to evaluate.
Yeah, you're never done.
Yep.
And that's good news or bad news, depending on your
Yeah,
perspective.
true. Yeah.
So, what's cyber risk management look like? Again, it could sound overwhelming, but it's really not. You do that baseline cyber risk assessment against either IG1 or IG2. That should produce a risk register and a risk mitigation roadmap. That should be an outcome of that initial assessment. You should do some internal and external vulnerability scanning. That's more the technical side. Here's the technical stuff we need to deal with, and then put together a prioritized plan of attack for both your vulnerabilities and your risk mitigation. And they're related, but they're kind of two different things. Continuous vulnerability management is only one of the 18 control families in the whole CIS framework. So,
Yep.
don't get fooled into saying, well, I think we're all set for security because we got a pretty tight vulnerability management program. That's great. But that's one of 18 things you need to worry about.
Yes, and I'll also throw out there for vulnerability management. It doesn't matter how good your vulnerability management if your patch timing is slow.
Yeah.
So you like think about how they kind of all connect together as you're working on these. And yes, I will push on external vuln scanning, which is to say, like, if you have an older network, there's probably things out there you're not aware of. It's worth the time to look at it.
Right. But the converse is true also. Like, I had a
True.
client
True.
who gave me their patch management report and it looked very good, but they hadn't done any vulnerability scanning.
Well, you do have to do both of them. That is
Yeah.
that is the hard part for sure. And thinking back to what we were talking about, like putting stuff behind VPNs, putting stuff behind borders that you control are great. But as you do that, think about the attack surface you're creating. Think about what will happen in that situation as well. Because sadly, that is what attackers will attack because that's there. Um, okay, so we're going to talk a little more about kind of how we approach meeting those control requirements with the fewest, ideally, with the fewest number of tools. And I want to make sure I push on that a little, which is to say, I know broadly in the industry there is a desire to have tool concentration or vendor concentration at the very least. But as you move into solving these problems, as you move into kind of your next adventure in solving CIS, GRC, and compliance, it's important to think about kind of where these things are supported, how you can solve the problems for yourself, and how you can find partners to really help you kind of drive those problems more specifically. So, CIS did change some with 8.1, but really in the grand scheme of it all, a lot of these compliance requirements are not wildly different. So it's really going to be about how can you improve your ability to meet the existing requirements, meet new requirements, and evolve with those requirements over time? Which is to say, having a hard and fast way of moving about control requirements or moving around compliance or security, it's great, but there has to be some amount of flexibility as you move into it, because there will always be flexibility on the attacking side. The attackers have the unlimited flexibility. There is some flexibility required, of course, on the defensive side that grows with that as well. In general, the benefit of something like CIS and fully implementing it is that you get that enhanced posture. It can be leveraged without overburdening, to Jim's point, without overburdening your teams, by really kind of breaking those down across the group, solving the areas that are drive the most risk for you, and being able to kind of enhance your posture by simplifying how you're managing your compliance into those specific areas. In general, though, security and compliance is only as effective as it is being handled in that organization. If only it would just build itself and solve itself, then I think all of us would be happier and less tired. But it is something that requires kind of that feeding. So working with situations or working with vendors or tools or whatever that drive solving those control requirements in the way that make the most sense to you. And as Jim was saying, in a way that doesn't necessarily, you don't need to boil the ocean. What you need to do is reduce your risk, solve those problems, and move forward. And of course, as we continue to move forward, and especially in the case of kind of your partners who you're working with, MSPs, MSSPs, they can be great force multipliers for you. There are organizations like Blumira and Trava that are going to provide you a service on the compliance or security side. We are going to help you in one way, whereas having another hand to help you in to kind of solve problems from an IT or service perspective can definitely be a big force multiplier for you. But make sure that you're leveraging them in the way that works for you and for the compliance you're trying to move forward into. And the way that I kind of like to position this, and the way that I look at this, is depending on who you're using, they may have a different view of compliance than you do. They may have a different view of governance than you do as well. So especially when we look at how CIS is growing, how CMMC is changing, how do those roll up into that managed service? What service are they providing via that? How does that align with everything that Jim was just talking about? What are your controls? How do they align with what is being provided? And make sure that you are working with your managed service providers to, if you have one, to really drive that success for both of you, because they're going to learn a lot from it. You will as well, and you both can grow on that successful side. And of course, it's worth mentioning for everyone in general that supply chain attacks are real, and APTs are happy to leverage supply chain attacks more than anyone else because they get more from it. We can go back to force multipliers on the attacking side. If you can attack Kaseya and distribute malware through every single MSP that uses it, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck as an APT or a large-scale ransomware attack. So think about kind of how your networks are built, how there could be a supply chain attack, and I'm sure your MSP will want to talk to you about it anyways, because they should probably be thinking about it as well. And of course, make sure their services support your compliance needs before you have an incident. You don't want to find out that there was a hole that you didn't think was a hole after you get an incident, because then your risk changes, how that will impact your business changes, everything changes at that point, because it can be hard to know kind of as you tier up think of it as your channel providers, who is doing support for you? Why are they supporting that part of your compliance? What are they doing as well to really support that compliance for you? And I included this graphic to the right because I'd like to talk about this just broadly in the industry, where there is a desire right now to aim more toward checking the box and not necessarily toward reducing risk. And I think it's really important to note that checking the box, because a lot of people are sick compliance, totally understandable. But compliance is there for a reason. Governance is there for a reason. Making sure that you are meeting the specific needs of that and reducing the risk in your environment is important. And making sure you have the data to bring to bear when and if you do have an incident, when and if you do get audited, is really, really important as well. So making sure you're pulling in as much data as possible out of your environment to get the insights into your environment will always be important. And just broadly about compliance, you want tools that are going to help you solve those problems, but it's important to think about the scope and the needs of your environment. Do you also need CIS compliance? I linked in here, and we could put it in the chat. There's a good CIS control that maps to CIS for those of you who are working with law enforcement as well in your organizations. And that's one of those areas that we see all the time where CIS just kind of hits people in the face. And they're like, oh, I need to store data for that long. I need to pull all of this information. And we have state and local governments that have to monitor every police car, for example, because the FBI and CIS has asked them, you need to be giving us audit logs from every police car that exists in this county. And for those situations, a lot of organizations haven't thought about that, because I didn't think about it until we had that conversation, and or have not really put that into their risk register yet of where is the full risk outlay of my environment. So we use those opportunities to identify partners that will support that compliance journey, right? It's really hard to do all of it segmented. What you can do, though, is kind of build that process to solve your compliance risks and governance inside your effort. And what that should do is grow your security maturity as you continue to kind of execute on those things. Security maturity drives compliance, it drives defense, it drives prevention. That is what security maturity does. And you can see that kind of if you think back to the beginning of the presentation, plain text password files is a perfect example of security maturity being low in an organization. Where are password managers being leveraged? How are people sharing sensitive information? How is data coming in and out of that network? These kind of things are driven by compliance. Things are going to get asked that you have to figure out and answer. And force multipliers like Trava are going to help you really solve those problems. Blumira has compliance-based reporting for a large number of, and we'll talk about this a little more in a sec, but it's really more, I mean this not in an insult to Blumira, but it's really more about how you as an organization are going to drive your maturity. The vendors out there like Blumira are going to be able to support you from a data and discovery perspective, but it's your company, it's your thing, and as a whole, it's yours to solve in the grand scheme of it all. And Jim, I wanted to pass over you to talk about public utilities.
You bet. So we're running a little short on time, but
Yeah.
I felt like we wanted to give a little bit of love to public utilities. We've been
Yes.
talking a lot about just government agencies in general, and you don't have to look very closely at this slide to know that public utilities have a whole can of worms that they need to worry about just in terms of standards. What I like about this particular chart is it starts at the top with kind of the strategic, the programmatic type standards like ISO 27001 that we're all familiar with. So it's important not to just jump down to the control security stuff like IEC 62443, but you have to start at the top with, let's put a reasonable security program in place, which includes proper risk management, which is what we've been talking about, which is how CIS comes in. So the CIS umbrella still works for public utilities. It's just a matter of the specific safeguards that you need to put in place as a public utility are down into the weeds of the industrial controls like IEC 62443. That was really the point of this slide. But the
Yeah,
process, I think the next slide goes on to process.
well, this was the
Yes. So more specifically, that's right. Director Ray is saying that the China is specifically setting up, malware to live inside and just let it sit there. Again, it's called that advanced persistent threat. It just sits there quietly until they decide to deploy it in many public utilities for geopolitical purposes. So,
Yep.
sewage treatment plants. So picture public utilities like sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants, electrical utilities, et cetera, all suddenly going offline for geopolitical reasons. That's what really this warning is all about.
And kind of thinking back to where we started, that goes back to attack surface, right? There are so many OT technologies that public utilities use that have hard-coded vulnerabilities at this point, and
they're so old. That's right.
It is a situation where you got to do that assessment and evaluate what is exposed, how is it exposed, what happened while it was exposed. So I'll give it back to you, John.
Exactly. I've already talked about the overall process. I mentioned this Plan, Do, Check Act. That is an underlying process that really underlies all ISO standards. In security, it underlies ISO 27001, but it's the same process that underlies quality standards like ISO 9001. And so this goes back to the point that Matt was making earlier, that this is not a one and done thing. It's a perpetual motion machine once you get it going. You plan, you do, you check, you act. You plan, you do, you check, you act, forever and ever and ever.
Forever and ever, indeed. It's the joy of it all in cybersecurity and compliance. You keep going. And I'll do this slide short quickly because I know we're running short on time. And in general, to Jim's point and everything we've been talking about today, not only is there a large attack surface, not only is it being targeted by APTs, not only is it a situation where the technology is generally aged, but there's always going to be a minimal budget, and it's going to be difficult to have high security maturity because there often aren't people being brought to bear to solve these problems in these areas. So as you move forward through, working on CIS, working on compliance, looking at your public utilities and how you can improve it, a lot of this is going to be evaluating what is the current state of that public utility and how can it be at least be inched forward. And here in the last section, we're going to be talking quickly about partnering with Trava and Blumira. First up, we'll let Jim go.
Yeah, so super quickly, we are compliance advisory and compliance. So, we if you have the personnel in-house, we'll help you with your risk assessment, risk register, risk mitigation roadmap, et cetera. If you want to be compliant to a certain standard, we can help you do that. If you don't have compliance people in-house, you can just outsource it all to us. The end.
And I will also do quick for Blumira. We are a SIM and XDR platform. What we're going to do is we're going to pull in your data. We're going to help you support your compliance and governance methods. We're going to give you that ability to kind of start moving toward prevention, as well as reacting when there are proper threats in your environment. We work with a lot of state and local and public utilities. If you have a crazy OT air gap environment, do I have a crazy idea for you? And we have a lot of different ways to help people kind of solve those problems through a really fast onboarding, 2 to 8 hours, which is crazy for a SIM, and really kind of start to drive people toward how can we solve the problems? How can we, kind of what Jim was saying, how can we take our governance ideas and our moves forward and drive that maturity leveraging data coming out of our environment? And last, we also linked some resources here as well that we'll share. CISA always is a great resource for people. Check out some of the new executive orders that came down that are going to impact people, generally speaking. If you touch anything around CJIS, law enforcement, it's worth reviewing. Security mapping, how those fit together. In my experience, CJIS is the one that tends to kick people in the face when the FBI does an audit. So it's worth evaluating kind of what is the expectation for what your law enforcement is doing versus what is happening in your environment as it stands today. And for kind of our last kind of recap and check-in as we wrap up for today, we wanted to ask which of the updated CIS control categories best help safeguard public utilities and government agencies. And this is, of course, severe pop quiz for all of you. And just to wrap it up, because I know we're coming up on time, I wanted to touch, Jim, if you want to touch on this, and then we'll touch on Blumira.
Yes. So, we all hope that we never have a real incident, right? But the most important thing that you can do is be prepared, because the time to figure out what to do in terms of responding to an incident is not when the incident is happening. So that's why we have these things called tabletop exercises. And that's what this is about. That QR code will let you download this one pager about these incident response tabletops that Trava does all the time with customers. So that's what that's about.
Perfect. And we love tabletops here. This is talking about a tabletop that we as an organization are, we're going to be talking about. Amanda Berlin, our ID lead, incident detection engineering lead, will be director. She is now. I think we'll have to update her title on there, is leading this in next week to talk about tabletop exercises similar to Trava. The way that we look at this, the way that I often talk about this, is you want to practice, because when it finally happens, you will have no idea what to do. Right. And it isn't because you don't know what to do. It's because you will get essentially kicked in the face and have to solve that problem while getting kicked in the face. And if you practice, you evaluate, you do tabletops internally with places like Trava, and you think about how you're going to execute on these problems when they happen, it gets so much easier when and if it actually happens. It
Yeah,
is,
like I always say, you take care of those. Well, I never thought of that.
yes,
Only in
exactly.
the tabletop.
Yes, yes. Like in our last tabletop here at Blumira, we asked the question of what if all the internet stopped working in the Midwest? How would we manage Blumira still?
Right,
And that is something that can happen. There's no reason it can't happen. So it
right,
is really important to think broadly, like how is this going to impact your environment? And include people who are not from IT. Like please
right.
include people who to Jim, to what you were saying earlier, they have responsibility, they have impact at the top here. There is management that should have impact.
Well, we ask questions like, when do you call law enforcement? When do you
Mm,
call your cyber insurance company? When do you
yep.
call your attorney?
And do you know, the one that I always like is, do you know what IR companies your insurance company is going to require you to use? Because if
Yeah,
I
what's
hand
your
you an IR
insurance
company,
company's? They call it a panel. Who's your
yes,
insurance company's panel?
exactly. Yes. You don't want people like me just handing you an IR if that's not an approved IR vendor.
Right.
It will only cost you a lot of money and won't be fun for anyone. Trust me. So last slide. Please try Blumira. Please try Trava. Blumira, of course, you heard you could try it for free. We also have a free domain scan up on our site if you're interested. We really try to support people as much as possible from the standpoint of kind of the beginning of their journey in SIM, or if you're deep into your journey in SIM and threat detection using data. We are here to help you however we can. And I will pass it over to Jim talking about
And we
Trava.
have a free risk assessment.
Perfect. So if you're looking for compliance or cybersecurity help, please reach out to Trava and Blumira.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I see Zoe's back.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Matt. And thank you to our attendees for joining us today. Please keep an eye out. We will be sending an email with the recording of this webinar once it's available. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today and hope to see you on a future partnered webinar very soon. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.